This locomotive was so massive that most railroads couldn't even use it. The tracks would have collapsed. The Yellowstone 2884 wasn't just big. It was one of the largest and most powerful steam locomotives ever built, a machine designed to do what other engines simply couldn't. But here's what makes this story fascinating. These giants were built for a very specific purpose, and when that purpose disappeared, so did they. So what made the Yellowstone so special? Why did railroads need something this extreme? And why did most people forget they ever existed? Let's break it down. To understand the Yellowstone, you have to understand the problem it was built to solve. By the 1920s and 1930s, iron ore was the lifeblood of American industry. Steel mills in the Midwest needed endless supplies of ore from the mines of Minnesota. And getting that ore from the ground to the mills meant hauling some of the heaviest freight on Earth. Iron ore is dense, incredibly dense. A single car of ore weighed far more than a car of coal or grain. And the railroads serving these mines needed to move thousands of tons at a time, often over difficult terrain with steep grades. Smaller locomotives couldn't handle it alone. Railroads were forced to double-head or triple-head trains, using multiple engines with multiple crews just to move one train. That was expensive, complicated, and slow. So the question became simple. Could someone build a single locomotive powerful enough to do the job alone? The answer would become one of the most impressive steam locomotives ever designed. But getting there meant pushing the limits of what steel and steam could actually do. In 1928, the American Locomotive Company, ALCO, delivered something unprecedented. A 2884 articulated locomotive built specifically for the Duluth, Missabe, and Iron Range Railway. That wheel arrangement tells you everything. 2 leading wheels to guide the locomotive. 2 sets of 8 massive driving wheels, 16 in total, to put power to the rails. And 4 trailing wheels to support an enormous firebox. The name Yellowstone came from the Northern Pacific Railway, which also ordered these locomotives for service near Yellowstone National Park, but it was the iron ore railroads that truly put them to work. And work they did. A single Yellowstone could haul loads that previously required 2 or 3 smaller engines. 1 locomotive. 1 crew. Thousands of tons of ore moving behind it. But how did they actually generate that much power? What made the Yellowstone capable of doing what other locomotives couldn't? The answer lies in the engineering, and it's more interesting than you might expect. First, the articulated design. Unlike rigid-frame locomotives, the Yellowstone had 2 separate engine units under one boiler. The front engine could pivot independently from the rear. Why does that matter? Because a locomotive this large would never make it around curves otherwise. The articulated design let the Yellowstone navigate the same tracks as smaller engines, despite being massively longer and heavier. It could flex where rigid locomotives would derail. Second, the firebox. And this is where the Yellowstone really separated itself. The firebox on a Yellowstone was enormous. Over 180 square feet of grate area on some variants. That's larger than many living rooms. This massive firebox could burn coal at rates that generated incredible amounts of steam. More steam meant more power. And more power meant the ability to start and move trains that would have stalled smaller engines completely. Every locomotive has to distribute its weight across the rails. Too much weight in one spot, and you crack rails, damage bridges, and destroy the track underneath you. So, how do you build a locomotive this heavy without destroying the railroad it runs on? The Yellowstone spread its weight across 24 wheels, 12 axles in total. That 2884 arrangement wasn't just about power, it was about keeping the weight per axle within acceptable limits. Even so, the Yellowstone was restricted to routes with heavy-duty track and reinforced bridges. Most railroads simply couldn't handle a locomotive this massive. The ones that could used them relentlessly. Only a handful of railroads ever operated Yellowstone locomotives, and each one had specific, demanding needs. Duluth, Missabe, and Iron Range Railway. The DM&IR was the original customer. They needed to haul iron ore from Minnesota's Missabe Range to Lake Superior ports. Grades were steep. Loads were brutal. The Yellowstone handled it. The Northern Pacific Railway gave the class its name. They used Yellowstones for heavy freight across the mountains and plains of the northern United States, terrain that demanded both power and endurance. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad's Yellowstones, designated EM1, were some of the last built. They worked heavy coal trains through the Appalachian Mountains until diesel finally took over. Southern Pacific ran their own version, sometimes called the AC9 class, across the western deserts and mountain grades, routes where only the most powerful locomotives survived. Each railroad pushed these machines hard, and for years, the Yellowstones delivered. But nothing lasts forever. Here's the twist most people don't expect. The Yellowstone was still performing beautifully when the railroads decided to scrap them. By the late 1940s and 1950s, diesel-electric locomotives were taking over American railroads. Not because they were more powerful, many weren't, but because they were cheaper to operate, easier to maintain, and didn't need water stops every 100 miles. Steam locomotives like the Yellowstone required enormous infrastructure: coaling towers, water treatment plants, ash pits, roundhouses with specialized equipment, and crews trained specifically for steam operation. Diesel simplified everything. One locomotive type could handle freight, passengers, and switching. Maintenance was predictable, fuel was standardized, and you didn't need a small army just to keep things running. So the Yellowstones were retired. Not because they failed, but because the world changed around them. Most were scrapped within years of retirement. Decades of engineering excellence melted down for the steel. But not all of them. A handful of Yellowstones survived, saved by museums, historical societies, and people who understood what these machines represented. Today, you can still see them. The DM&IR number 225, located in Proctor, Minnesota, near the entrance to the Proctor Golf Course, sits preserved in Duluth, Minnesota. The DM&IR number 227 sits preserved in Duluth, Minnesota. The DM&IR number 229 can be found with the Lake County Historical Society. All reminders of the iron ore trains that built American industry. Unfortunately, none of the EM1s were preserved, although there were multiple attempts. When you stand next to a Yellowstone, you understand scale in a way that numbers can't communicate. The boiler stretches above your head. The driving wheels are taller than most people. The tender behind it seems to go on forever. These weren't just machines. They were solutions to impossible problems. Engineers looked at the heaviest freight in America and said, "We'll build something that can move it." And they did. The Yellowstone 2884 represents a moment when steam power reached its absolute peak. Not the fastest locomotives, not the most famous, but among the most capable machines ever put on rails. They didn't last long. But while they worked, nothing else came close. So here's the question. If you could see one preserved steam locomotive in person, would you choose the famous ones, the big boys, the challengers? Or would you seek out the ones most people have forgotten, like the Yellowstone? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what you'd pick. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most powerful and overlooked locomotives ever built, hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories like this coming, machines that changed industries, solved impossible problems, and then quietly disappeared.